Good morning, everyone. Hope you're doing well. I thought I'd speak this morning about a character who pops up in my book, Ancient Kings and Everyday Lessons. He forms part of one of the chapters of the book. His name's Abijam, sometimes called Abijah, but it is the same man. Not one of the better known kings, but yet we can still learn quite a lot from his life. I'm just going to read to you a little bit about him in the biblical accounts. So firstly, 1 Kings chapter 15. Abijam began to rule over Judah in the 18th year of Jeroboam's reign in Israel. He reigned in Jerusalem 3 years. His mother was Maacah, the daughter of Absalom. He committed the same sins as his father before him, and he was not faithful to the Lord his God, as his ancestor David had been. But for David's sake, the Lord his God allowed his descendants to continue ruling, shining like a lamp, and he gave Abijam a son to rule after him in Jerusalem. That's one account. The other account, or part of it, is I'm going to read from in 2 Chronicles chapter 13. War broke out between Abijah and Jeroboam. Now Jeroboam, just to explain, was the king of Israel, the northern kingdom. He'd broken away from the line of David and had set up his own larger kingdom. Judah, led by King Abijah, fielded 400,000 select warriors, while Jeroboam mustered 800,000 select troops from Israel. When the army of Judah arrived in the hill country of Ephraim, Abijah stood on Mount Zemaraim and shouted to Jeroboam and all Israel, "Listen to me. Don't you realize that the Lord, the God of Israel, made a lasting covenant with David, giving him and his descendants the throne of Israel forever? Yes, yet Jeroboam, son of Nebat, a mere servant of David's son Solomon, rebelled against his master. Then a whole gang of scoundrels joined him, defying Solomon's son Rehoboam when he was young and inexperienced, and could not stand up to them. Do you really think you can stand against the kingdom of the Lord that is led by the descendants of David? You may have a vast army, and you have those gold calves that Jeroboam made as your gods, but you have chased away the priests of the Lord, the descendants of Aaron, and the Levites, and you have appointed your own priests, just like the pagan nations." And after that, they had this war. And then what happened? At the sound of their battle cry, God defeated Jeroboam and all Israel and routed them before Abijah and the army of Judah. The Israelite army fled from Judah, and God handed them over to Judah in defeat. Two very different accounts of the same man, king I'm going to refer to as Abijam. So how can we reconcile these two seemingly contradictory accounts of this man's life? Abijam was the son of Rehoboam, who you may remember was the man who lost most of his kingdom, partly down to his own foolishness, but partly because it was the will of God, because Solomon had actually turned away from following God. Abijam only ruled for 3 years. It was a short reign, and for most of that time he was at war with Jeroboam's nation of Israel. And in one account, he seems to be a great man of God. He seems to be doing all the right things, saying all the right things. But the other account tells a very different story. And I think these two accounts can be reconciled between the public persona of Abijam and the private man, which told us who he really was and what he was really like before God. And the challenge for us really is our private and public persona the same? Because if it's vastly different, then that means that we're not really acting with integrity. Abijam was certainly used of by God. He was used of by God to foster a sense of national pride, to foster a pride in worshipping God, the God of Israel. I think in some ways he'd have been used by God to promote some sort of revival of interest in the things of God, and a nation which was much weakened by being split into two. I think he would have been very encouraging to a lot of people who wanted to see God's name magnified and glorified. But yet, the account in 1 King suggests that he didn't really follow God with his own heart. He reminds me in some ways of politicians in election year, particularly in the United States, where you've got a massive Christian electorate, and a lot of politicians will be boasting about their credentials as good Christians, as good men and women of God who follow him, who are defenders of the gospel, defenders of all sorts of moral issues. But the reality is often, I fear, rather different. Of course, I'm not going to make judgment on every single person, but I imagine that a lot of it is electioneering and an attempt to gain popularity, favour, and of course, ultimately votes. Perhaps we could even say the same of Donald Trump, the recent president of the US, who seemed to stand up for Christian rights, who made great play of praying with pastors in public. But his character seemed not to measure up with the public persona. And that was quite disturbing to see how he acted in public, in private, and some of the sort of gracelessness with which he acted at times. Now, I'm not here to stand in judgment over him or any other person, but it is always disturbing to see a very big disconnect between the public and the private, the claims people make about God and their faith and the reality of their lives. I wouldn't doubt that Trump was in many ways used by God to defend things which would be, I would imagine, on God's heart. And that often is the case, even with people who don't follow God in the first place. Because God is the Lord of all, and he can make leaders of nations putty in his hands, whether they acknowledge him or not. If we were to read right to the end of the biblical book of 2 Chronicles, it will tell us about how the kingdom of Judah was eventually exiled to Babylon. And then Babylon itself fell to the Persians and Medes. And the Jews, of course, are still exiles there. But there was a great king called Cyrus. And the Bible tells us that he was actually inspired by God. He acknowledged that the God of Israel was prompting him to do this. And what he said was, he encouraged the Jews to go home, to go back to Israel, to go back to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple and to worship their God. But there's no historical evidence that Cyrus actually put his trust in the God of Israel, turned from his own religion or anything else. But yet God still used him. We must pray for our leaders, whether they're Christians or not, whether they acknowledge God or not, that they'll make wise and godly decisions for the good of the nation and for the honour of our Lord, for the good of the gospel, for the good of those who follow him. That doesn't mean they necessarily will follow them themselves. But there's also a challenge for you and me. There's a challenge about our public and private persona. I think there's a special challenge for Christian leaders, for those who preach from pulpits, from conference hall venues, on online podcasts. So often, sadly, you found great Christian leaders who have done great things for God have been found wanting in their private lives in an awful way. There's been some horror stories of great Christian leaders falling from grace because their private lives have been massively disconnected with what they've shown in public. They haven't measured up. They haven't walked the walk. It's been more as a do as I say, not as I do. Whether that's sexual misconduct, abuse, bullying, or financial misconduct. Those don't do any favours for the honour of God or the gospel message. And so Christian leaders especially need to be very careful that what they're saying in public isn't complete hypocrisy, because they're not living it themselves. But yet I think there's a challenge for all of us. If we claim to follow God, are we living it out? Or can even non-Christians see that we're being hypocrites? Are we men and women of integrity? Are we the same in church or in our workplace or in the public domain as we are behind closed doors at home on our own or with our families? Is our public persona the same as our private reality? A really good example of someone who did this right was Joseph, the son of Jacob, one of the patriarchs of Israel. He was mightily used up by God. He had a great faith in God. God spoke to him in his dreams. And yet one day he was offered, he wasn't more than offered, he was almost coerced into having an illicit affair with his master's wife. who I guess was a very attractive woman. And she had the power to make sure that no one would find out about this, or that would have been the temptation. But Joseph said, no, I will not sin against God and against my master. I will not do this. He actually got into serious trouble for it, because she was someone who sought revenge against him when he spurned her advances. But Joseph decided to be a man of integrity, that his private persona was the same as his public one, because he knew that God sees all things. We cannot hide the private from God, even if we can from other people. Although, as we know, often these things come to light in the end, in any case. But let's be people of integrity who are the same in public, or as near to being the same in public. I know we're all going to fail on this one way or another, but as near to being the same in public as we are in private. Let's not be like the figure of fiction of Jekyll and Hyde, who's that great Dr. Jekyll, the physician who does so much good. But then there's the alter ego, the sinister, wicked Mr. Hyde, who is less than pleasant, to say the least. Let's not be Jekyll and Hyde characters. Let's not be hypocrites who wear a mask in public, and then the real us is revealed, maybe to those closest to us, always hidden from view completely, but never from God. These things have a way of finding us out. But let's be people of integrity. Not the likes of Abijam, who says one thing and yet he seemed to completely reject God in his own life. But let's stand for the God and for what is right in all aspects of our lives, that we might follow him and bring glory to his name. May you be blessed today.